Okay, so welcome to the September 7th, 2023 program of the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society. It's great to introduce to you my old colleague at the Cactus and Succulent Society of America, Dan Mahr. I served on the board of directors with Dan for 10 of his 15 years, and I also served as his vice president during his term as president. Dan founded the Field Trip Program of CSSA and led it for 20 years. This gave him so many others opportunities to travel to succulent habitats throughout the world. It will be exciting to view these special places with him. Dan's program tonight is entitled Memorable Places and the Succulents That Live There. Please welcome my old friend, Dan Mahr.
So James Matthew Barry, who knows who that is? And okay, that's right. James Matthew Barry. So someone there should get a door prize already. But anyway, God gave us memories so that we might have roses in December. James was not from Arizona or Southern California. And so he had to have memory in order to appreciate roses in December. And somewhere I've got way too much technology here. So so this is a talk about memories. So as Dick indicated, I was head of the CSSA's Field Trips Program for about 20 years and organized trips to cactus and succulent habitats all around the world for CSSA members. And my wife was also an entomologist, but also a horticulturist, was the head of the Wisconsin Master Gardener Program for many, many years. And in her responsibilities, she organized horticultural and botanical trips for the master gardeners of the state of Wisconsin. And so between the two of us, we did a fair amount of traveling. And the red dots on the map indicate the countries where I have seen cactus and other succulent plants in their native habitats. And if you travel a lot, and I know everybody in this room has traveled some, even if it's just, into California or northern Mexico or someplace like that. But during the course of your travels, you encounter things that you remember, stick in your mind. If I ask you right now to think of a fond memory that you have from one of your trips, I'm sure that things immediately come to mind. And so this program is about memories. It's about my memories. I'm getting old enough where I don't have an awful lot of future travels, of at least lengthy travels, in my future. And so I'm to the point where I'm starting to put some of these things together and an opportunity to share with other people. And hopefully eventually what this will result in is some sort of a program which I can send out to all the affiliate groups of interesting places around the world that I've had the opportunity to experience. Who knows what country this is? Namibia, that's right. Who knows what plants those are? Welwitchias, that's right. So if you take the welwitchias out of this picture, you're looking at something that's pretty desolate, desert, and which in itself is memorable. I mean, it's beautiful scenery if you are like me and you happen to like the scenery of desert locations. But you add the welwitchias to them and all of a sudden it becomes a special place and a special memory. Now, not all places that have succulent plants, the memories are not always because of the succulent plants. There may be other things there as well. So the island of Tenerife and the Canary Islands. This is an echium, a borage. One of the tallest flower spikes is, things are like 10 feet tall. They're not succulents. The hillside is covered with aeoniums, which you know are succulents. They're probably not used a whole lot here other than as container plants. In Southern California, where I'm living now, everybody has aeoniums out because it's the right climate for them. The Canary Islands are a Mediterranean climate. Coastal Southern California is a Mediterranean climate. The hillside is covered with aeoniums. Do I remember the aeoniums? Not a one of them. I remember the echiums because they were just so spectacular. Maybe it's not plants, maybe it's animals. This is a Honduran white tent-making bat, little fuzzy golf balls, always white. There's a male and a harem, small harem of 4 or 5 females. And they're called tent-making bats because they live on heliconia leaves. And they chew through the main veins next to the midrib. And so the edges of the leaf fold down, making a tent. And that's where they roost at night. And they go around, they have several of these roosts around the rainforest, and they go from area to area. They're fruit eaters, and so it's just depending upon what happens to be in fruit in any given location. That's where they spend the night, in that particular tent. So this is the tropical rainforest. Excuse me, I have allergy problems, so I apologize. But this is a tropical rainforest of eastern Costa Rica. Typical rainforest. It's hard to avoid the rain. That's what it does. Are there succulents there? There's cactus there. There's epiphyllums. There's rhipsalis hanging from the trees. You know, epiphyllums, when they're not in bloom, and rhipsalis most any time, are not the most particularly charismatic succulents. Do I remember the epiphyllums and the rhipsalis? Yeah, I remember that they were there, but this is what I remember. This is what drives my memory of this particular location. Maybe it's not, excuse me, maybe it's not plants or animals at all. Maybe it's people. This is at about 16,000 feet in the Peruvian Andes. And this lady, I call her, she's Quechuan. That's her ethnicity. And I call her a textile artist. The hat that she's wearing is all very, very fine embroidery. She's also a weaver. They harvest the fur off of the alpacas, and they weave those into various sorts of things. Look at that face. Think of what that face has experienced in that lifetime. That's what I remember about this place. The hillsides have lobevias on them. You cactus people know what lobevias are. Nice spiny cactus. They're actually pretty nice lobevias. The lobevias were fine. This is my memory of that particular location, this woman. Yes, we did purchase. She had a little table set up by the side of the road. And and we did actually purchase some weavings from her. Very, very nice. Okay, let's start the real trip. Excuse me. This hopefully will eventually go away. We're going to, I have many, many more spots than what we're going to have time for. But we're going to start out in I'm not getting my pointer. I did something wrong. Okay, we'll do without it. We're going to start out in Southern Africa and go to a couple locations there. And just because I know there's a lot of cactus people in the room, we're going to hop across the Atlantic Ocean to the Andes area of South America, and we'll do some locations there. And then if there's still people in the room, we'll jump back and forth until we get through the program. So Africa, and specifically Southern Africa, and just a little bit of a geography refresher for those of you who may not remember too much about the various countries in Southern Africa. South Africa at the tip to its northwest on the west coast is Namibia. Above that is Angola. The central part of South Africa is the country of Botswana. And to the northeast of that is Zimbabwe. And above that is Zaire. Most of these are all really, really good succulent habitats. Not all of them, but most of them. So we're going to, I've picked out 4 or 5 spots. We're going to start out with 2 of them. The first one is going to be in South Africa, there in the very far south. And this is an area of South Africa called the Western Cape region. I suspect some of you have been into South Africa on trips. Raise your hands. Okay, a couple of you, few of you. It's in an area specifically, it used to be called Namaqualand. It's now called the Western Cape region. The provinces there are called regions. And Namaqualand simply means the land of the Nama people. The Nama people were the original ethnic people and the people who still live in this particular region. We're going to a very, very specific area, and most of these memorable places will be very local, fairly localized. We're going to a region of Namaqualand called the Coastal Sand Belt, and I'll explain that a little bit as we get through here, go through here. It's a winter rainfall area. It's kind of a Mediterranean climate, so it would be like coastal Southern California. And like coastal Southern California, it gets dense fogs. And in fact, dense fogs is probably what contributes most of the moisture for the succulents and the other plants that live there. It can be quite cool. If you are sleeping in a sleeping bag out in the open or a little pup tent or something, it's not unusual in the wintertime for you to wake up and there will be frost on your tent or on your sleeping bag. So, so cold temperatures are not atypical. We're at sea level and essentially right around sea level up to about 60 feet elevation. Now for each of the locations that we go to, I'm going to give you 2 satellite images. The first satellite image is if you're looking out of the window of the International Space Station. Yeah, the International Space Station. That's about 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. So that's the view that you would be getting. And I've got a bar there that gives you the approximate distance so that you have a sense as to the scale of area that we're dealing with. The 2 little yellow pins on the left-hand side, right on the coast, that's the area that we're going to be traveling in. And that's going to be a distance of about 15 miles. And it's going to be right along the coast. And we're never going to be more than about a half a mile from the ocean itself. And so the second picture, the second satellite image that I show you will be from about commercial airline height, about 35,000 feet elevation. So you're a lot lower and you can see the characteristics of the ground and the topography and whatnot much better. So if you look at this, it looks quite flat. Some of the other places that we'll be to, you'll see it's quite mountainous and quite rugged. This looks very flat. There's not much topography associated with it. And it's the sand veld. It is sand, it's sandy. Veld is Afrikaans, and the Afrikaans language means field, or more broadly, it means a broad, flat generally treeless area. So you can see for a long, long ways. So the Namaqualand coastal sand belt is what this area is called. If you go from left to right and you get to the right-hand side of the screen, you start seeing it more bumpy. The sand belt gradually merges into what's called the hard belt. Again, it's a fairly flat area, but it's very rocky. So the sand gradually gives way to a more rocky environment. And as you go from sand belt to rock belt, you go from different types of habitats and you get different types of plants. But we're going to concentrate in the sandy area. So this is what it looks like from the ground. This is my wife, Susan, doing what she does very, very well, which is nature photography. That you see in the background is the Atlantic Ocean. We're probably about a quarter of a mile. This is typical sandbelt vegetation. The further inland you get, the vegetation gets a little higher and a little denser, but in areas like this is very typical. You may know the name Namaqualand because it's so famous for its wildflower blooms, if you happen to be there in a good year where they've had reasonable rainfall. And so you can start to pick up here the variety of colors, the yellows and the whites and the pinks and the purples, and see the diversity of different types of plants that are blooming. And it can be quite spectacular during a really, really good floral display. So as I indicated, as you go a little bit further inland, you start picking up rocky outcroppings and you get somewhat different types of plants in areas like this. And the further you go inland, the denser those rocky outcrops get. So the area is not just for plants, it's for animals as well. And occasionally you get lucky enough to see one. This is a steenbok. Steenbok are small antelopes about this high. And not too uncommon, so it's not unusual to see this. But that little creature in the middle, this was a really rare experience. And this is one of the things that I remember about this place. This was one of the things that makes it a memorable place for me. This is one of the small native South African cats. And it's called a growl cat, which just means it's a gray cat. And it's about the size of a house cat, maybe even like a small house cat. And to see them in nature in the wild is just a really, really special experience. Sometimes it's the accommodations that you have that you remember. And normally when we go, I like to camp out, but sometimes you take advantages of what's available. Maybe it's an abandoned farmhouse. Here we're right on the ocean, and this is actually a fisherman's hut. And it happened to be not being occupied during the course of the evening, so we took it over. And we didn't have to put our tents up that night, but you look inside, this is kind of the lobby or the common area. This is where you check in and then take your bags to your room. The fireplace is to the left, and that's where you can cook your meals. In our case, cans of beans and things like that. And looking into the back there, those are the best bedrooms. Beds consisted of a sheet of plywood on a 2x4 frame. So, you know, memories, they're all memories. You wake up in the morning, you grab a cup of coffee. Not me, I don't drink coffee, but you walk out to the lobby area, and this is the view that you have. You're literally a stone's throw from the ocean. Memories. And in the rocks along there, there are certainly going to be succulents. Okay, so let's go to the plants. When there's a good wildflower bloom in South Africa, there's two main groups. There's lots and lots of different plant families that are represented, but there's two that are most common. And those are the daisy family, the Asteraceae or Compositae, such as we have here. And the other is the Mesembryanthemaceae, or the ice plant family, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But There are other groups as well, but this just happens to be a daisy. It's a non-succulent daisy, but I just wanted to put it in here to give you an idea as to the scope of plants that you might experience. There are daisies which are succulent. These are leaf succulents. This is in the genus Didelta, and the leaves are quite succulent, and it makes a very, very pretty display. Moving from the daisies, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of bulbs and corms. And the geophytic plants, that is plants that have major structures underneath the ground, are very, very important in this part of the world as well. And a lot of our garden bulbs come from South Africa. And this happens to be the genus Ferraria. It's a corm. It's in the iris family, the Iridaceae. And it's a bizarre thing. It's kind of a little difficult to see the actual flower structure, but the dark part in the center looks like it's got 5 or 6 arms sticking out. They're actually reflexed backwards, so you can't see it. You can see more of the disc. And the edges of the petals are very, very frilly. That's the yellow part that you see there. Very interesting plant. Also in the iris family is the genus Babiana. There's many different species of Babiana in this part of the world, and nice bright little red flowers. Probably the king of the bulbs, the bulb group, the geophytes, is this one. This is a Boaphene hemanthoides. Anyone grow this in your greenhouse? Does anyone grow the other Boaphene species, Boaphene distica? Very, very, very available in cultivation. These are huge bulbs. Very, very interesting wavy leaves on them. The bulbs, the base itself and kind of the fibrous part that you see there is an accumulation of years and years and years of the leaf bases. The bulb itself is only about a quarter of the size of that inside, but the whole structure there is about the size of a soccer ball. I mean, this is a massive, massive plant, and they look quite amazing here in the sand belt in this area. Boaphene hemanthoides. Another thing that Namaqua land is known for is its miniatures. And so you have to kind of watch where you're stepping, because there may be little tiny things on the ground. And this is Crassula barclayi. Some of you who have been growing succulents for 100 years may still have the old label on it, Crassula teres. It used to be called teres. When I was starting out in the hobby, I used to grow a lot of miniature crassulas, and this was called teres at the time. It's barclayi now. Very, very nice species. That clump is about 1.5 inches in diameter. So you can have a whole bunch of these in a little tiny space on the shelf. Another small crassula living in this area is tomentosa. Tomentosa simply means hairy, and it certainly is hairy. And here's one sending up its flower spike in the center. It hasn't started blooming yet, but it's getting ready to. This particular species is the one that dies after it blooms. So once that goes up, sometimes they offset, the old plant offsets, and sometimes they just set seed, and then you have to wait for new ones to germinate. There are euphorbias in the area. This is either Euphorbia tuberculata or ramaglans. I'm not a euphorbia person. Apparently, the name can be interchangeable, or at least 2 forms of the same species. This is one of the medusoid types, so it has a central area, central plant, and then all these various stems that branch off of it, like the head of a medusa. So Euphorbia tuberculata. These are young plants. oh, maybe 10 inches in diameter. But you find older plants as well, old enough that some of the older stems have already started to die off. And you can see the flower structures there as well. There are also members of the geranium family in this area. There are a lot of pelargoniums in Namaqualand and in South Africa. The one along this particular stretch of coast is a nice orange flowered one, Pelargonium fulgidum. Nice frilly leaves. It's a small thing, only stays a few inches high, with small flowers, but very, very brightly colored. Pelargonium fulgidum. Also in the geranium family is the genus Sarcocaulon, another group of succulents, usually spiny succulents. In fact, this one is called Sarcocaulon spinosum, and you can see the spines sticking out of it. And usually Sarcocaulons have either yellow or white flowers. There are some pale pink flowered species as well. Sarcocaulons. But by far the biggest group of succulents in this area along the sand belt here are the mesems, the ice plant family. And they are incredibly variable. And I'm only going to give you a few examples. This is one of the more striking ones, Jordaniella. The flowers on this one get to be about 3 inches in diameter. And and they grow in patches. And so when they're in full bloom, they're really, really striking. This is probably a Delosperma. I'm not a euphorbia person. I'm definitely not a mesem person. Trying to memorize the specific characteristics of all those little seed capsules so you can identify what genus is in is just way beyond my pay grade. So, but probably a Delosperma, pink purple flowered one, probably a Drosanthemum. So there's a lot of these that lie very close to the ground cover types of things. Nice flowers. Quite a few white flowered species. This is Conicosia with very thin, numerous petals. Lampranthus is a genus with a lot of woody, shrubby mesem species in it. And again, they're, as far as I'm concerned, they're impossible to tell apart, but you see a shrub like that, and some Lampranthus will get up to be 4, 5, 6 feet tall, and when they're covered with flowers, they're really quite spectacular. Monolaria, this is probably my favorite mesem. Monolaria moniliformis, very, very succulent leaves that are deciduous. So this is a mesem that in the dry season, the leaves are totally resorbed, the old dead leaves fall off, and then when the rainy season comes, they sprout new succulent leaves. But they have magnificent white flowers. They're just quite beautiful things. Lampranthus. Lampranthus is quite variable. You can have yellow flowers, white flowers, pink flowers, purple flowers. And most people think of, when they think of the mesem family, the Mesembryanthemaceae, they think of two things: ice plants, which are kind of ground covers, or these very charismatic little things that we like to put in pots, like conophytums and lithops and those sorts of things. But there's one genus which is quite large, the genus Stoberia. These actually make small trees, and they generally grow more inland, but we did find them here along the coast as well. So these plants are certainly up around 4, 5, 6 feet high. Little tiny white flowers. This is not something that you probably want to grow unless you're a real specialist in mesems and just have to have the genus represented. But you can see the little succulent leaves. They almost look like little ice plant leaves on very, very woody, dense woody stems. In fact, the locals appreciate the wood so much, its density, and they use it for firewood. So they chop these plants down and use them locally for that reason. And we go from the biggest mesems to the littlest mesems. This is a conophytum, Conophytum minudum. Again, that clump is probably about 1.5 inches in diameter. Very, very typical. This particular species loves the coast. And we stopped at many, many places up and down the coast. And virtually wherever you stop, you see lots and lots of Conophytum minudum. You also see it inland, but you can see it growing right in the splash zone of the surf, which to me means that this has to be somewhat resistant to salty water. And you can find it in places so dense that you literally cannot walk without stepping on them. They're that common, Conophytum minudum. Okay, we're gonna jump from South Africa up to Namibia, and we're gonna go way up far to the north of Namibia, where the little red circle is. Namibia is, we're going to the northwestern region of it, which is called Kunini, the Kunini region, and that name is derived from the river that forms the border between the countries of Namibia and Angola. It's a region that years and years and years ago used to be called Kaokaland. And we're going specifically to a spot on the river which is called Ipupa Falls, named after the little local village that's there. And we're going to be at 2,100 feet. Now, any of you who read your newsletter, or I read it on your website, that it said we were going to be at 21,000 feet. No, 2,100 feet. So Namibia, you may be familiar with, has the famous Namib Desert. You may have seen pictures on television about the famous desert elephants of Namibia, the Namib Desert elephants. I'm going to walk up here to the screen. The Namib Desert is a coastal desert, and it's this area right along the coast. It goes inland maybe 10, 15 miles. It's a very narrow desert, and it's fairly flat and sandy. It's kind of, other than it has a lot of sand dunes, it's kind of like the sand belt, but it's very, very dry. And then when you start getting into this area, you can see quite a difference in the satellite imagery. You get into a hilly and mountainous area, which is called the Central Escarpment of Namibia. And it's hilly terrain, mountainous terrain, and botanically it's a lot more interesting than the Namib Desert itself. It gets a little bit more rainfall than what would be classified as a true desert, but it is still a very dry habitat with a lot of succulents. As soon as you get past the Central Escarpment, you get into another broad, flat area, and this is the beginning of the Kalahari. The Kalahari then extends into Botswana and further to the east. So where we're going to be is where that yellow map pin is up there, on the border, on the Kunini River, and an area which is called Ipupa Falls. And this is the lower view, the commercial airline view of the location. So the Kunini River, so north of the river is Angola, south of the river is Namibia. And the Kunini River comes out of the Angola mountains, a little bit off to the right of the screen, and comes down, and then it goes west. It heads west and eventually dumps out into the Atlantic Ocean. And again, that's what forms the border between the two countries. And as it's going along, it encounters, right about where the map pin is, it encounters a change in the geology. and the rocks are much harder and they're not eroded as much. And so the river channel becomes a lot narrower, and the river backs up, and all that green that you see is riverine vegetation. We'll show close-up pictures in a second. And then it hits the area where it is eroded away into the waterfalls, the famous Ipupa waterfalls. All righty, now I can't. Oh, there we go. All right, just had to show you a picture of a normal hard day after botanizing all day long. That's our camp rig. They sell a lot of Pringles in South Africa and Namibia, so it's a good snack to go with your local beer or whatever. But this is the river as it's approaching the falls. There on the left, you can see a little bit of mist from the falls. And you can see the rapids just before they get to the falls. And this is what the waterfalls look like. Now look carefully along the left-hand bank, and you see great big fat trees. What are those? Yeah, baobab trees. And this is probably the most striking feature of this area. There's a lot of striking things there's a lot of reasons why this is a memorable place. But I happen to be a person who enjoys succulent trees or semi-succulent trees. And this is just a very, very iconic view of what the baobabs look like clinging to the cliffs in the middle of the waterfall. And just to show you several pictures of that. We're going to come back a bit from the waterfalls, maybe like a half a mile back. This is the local village of Ipupa. The native people there are called the Himba people, and they're pastoralists. They have goats primarily, which is what they herd. If you look in the background, the mountains are in Angola. The blue that you see are the Makalani palms, which are the major palm species that live along the river in this part of Africa. And in the foreground, the plant that you see with the little pink flowers on it, that's an adenium bohmianum. This is the westernmost species of all the desert roses, or all the adeniums. If you turn around from that same spot and look up, look up into the hills, and the hills are covered with interesting vegetation of a variety of types, including succulents. A couple more pictures of the adeniums, Adenium bohmianum. They start blooming when they're only about 8 or 10 inches high, and they will eventually form plants that I'm sure are hundreds of years old, that are taller than I am and have trunks that are maybe 18 inches in diameter. Usually pink, very characteristic, pale pink with a deeper purpley pink center. Occasionally you can see white flowered individuals that don't have the pink pigmentation to them. Another group of plants that are in this area that I'm particularly fond of is the genus Conifera, succulent and semi-succulent trees. And Namibia is full of these that are just wonderful, wonderful plants, some of them that are very stunted and dwarfed and bonsai-like with great big fat trunks. This particular, I'm just giving you one, there's probably 5 or 6 species here at Ipupa Falls. This is one that's very recognizable. It's called Conifera virgata, and makes a nice little tree. Further south in Namibia, it forms a bush that is usually no more than waist high. So there's variability in the species from location to location. One of the characteristics is the peeling bark. Very thin white peeling bark that peels off in strips, and then you have this kind of bronzy colored bark underneath of it. You can see the bark just hanging from the trees like strips of paper. More baobabs along the river, and a baobab fruit. There's also euphorbias in this area along the near the river at Ipupa. This is one of the spiny mound-forming euphorbias, Euphorbia subsalsa. Those mounds are probably about 4 to 5 feet in diameter and knee high, or maybe just a little higher than knee high. Quite spiny things. Probably would make attractive pot plants, maybe something to grow this species. This is another very interesting euphorbia, Euphorbia lesneri. Whereas the previous euphorbia grows out in the open, this tends to be an understory plant. And there's also a Hoodia, a stapeliad and Asclepiad in the background. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But these Euphorbia lesneri are very, very attractive plants. I've just recently started seeing them show up in the nursery trade. But they're very limited in their distribution in nature. I don't think that they can be propagated from cuttings, but possibly. But they make, again, nice little plants. That plant is probably about 3 feet tall, and that's about as big as they get. You can see the green bumpy succulent stems on them. Hoodia parviflora, those of you who are familiar with stapeliads, this is in that group. I think this is the tallest of all species of stapeliads in the milkweed family. They get to be about 6 feet tall, which is about what this one is. And being an entomologist, I have to take pictures of the bugs that I find along the way as well, sitting on a Hoodia. Another interesting plant that I don't think is in cultivation, some of you may be familiar with the genus Serraria. Used to be in the Portulaca family. So there's Serraria namaquensis and Serraria pygmaea and Serraria fruticulosa. Those have all been in the trade for a long time. They're small species. They stay nice as container plants. But there are arborescent species as well. And this one is Serraria longipedunculata. It just looks like kind of a scruffy tree. But if you look closely at it, you see it has leaves very similar to the other Serraria species, little succulent leaves on it. And I'm going to stop here at, we're going to jump now, but this is the last species from the Pupa Falls area. This is in the sesame family, and it's, which is the Pedaliaceae. This is Pterodiscus. The genus Pterodiscus are little small shrubby things. They have tuberous succulent rootstocks, which can be raised up and displayed. Different species have different colors of flowers, which are usually quite attractive. And there in the lower left, you can see seed pods starting to develop. They have these winged seed pods that kind of tumble across the desert and eventually release the seeds from them. Okay. So, Richard, when should I shut up? Well, I know I'm going to keep going. There's no question about that, but just for planning purposes. Keep going. All right, keep going. So we're coming back to the New World, coming back to South America, and we're going to start in those 2 red circles. And the first red circle is going to be the lower one, and that's in northwestern Argentina. And it's in the province of Salta, and we're going to be up at about 9,000 feet elevation. So one thing I should mention here is that for some reason I'm attracted to higher elevations. There's just something about the air, there's something about the light, there's something about the sky. Usually at high elevations, you're above the tree line and you can see forever. So you can see the topography, you can see the geology. You can, it's just, I don't know, I like higher elevations. So this particular, so all the stops that we're going to make in South America are going to be high up in the Andes. And this particular one is going to be at 9,000 feet, which is kind of average for our locations. So I like this satellite image because it gives you a very, very good sense of the meteorology of the Andes Mountains. So kind of right down the middle of the slide, to the left it's brown and to the right it's green. And that's because the prevailing winds bring the fronts off of the ocean, off of the Atlantic Ocean from the east. The clouds pile up against the high Andes Mountains, drop their water, and everything is green. And that water all drains into the Amazon basin. So the other side of the mountains don't get very much rain at all. And so that's why in these images they're brown, because there's nothing, no green foliage on the ground. So that map pin, yellow map pin again, is where we're going. And this is what it looks like from a lower elevation. And unlike what we were seeing in the sand belt, where everything is flat, you can see here that there's quite a bit of quite rugged topography. So high mountains, up and down mountains, lots of valleys. When you see areas like this, you see all of those little valleys, all the mountains, everything make for slightly different microenvironments, microclimates. And it's for that reason that you get into mountains like this and you get a lot of natural speciation, because around each turn in the mountain is a little bit different habitat, which may favor a different species to survive and to prosper there. So this is what it looks like from the ground. And this again is another one of the locations that was illustrated in your newsletter. But you can see that there's, especially on the slopes, there's not much vegetation. You get into the lower areas where there's some runoff, you'll see a little bit more greenery. I wish I knew more about geology. This is a very, very interesting location from a geological perspective. The rock formations and the mountain formations, that's very, very crumbly, and it's very easily eroded. And we get into this nice forest of tall Echinopsis atacamensis, the subspecies, which is called Pasacana. And walking around in there is just, it's magical. It's memory making, it's memorable. Echinopsis atacamensis. So how tall are those plants? They're not like your saguaros here in Arizona. They're big ones, maybe up around 12 feet or so in height. Seedlings on the right, this is a very healthy population. There were a lot of young ones coming on board. In addition, there's smaller cacti growing in the same area. There's a couple of species in the Opuntia, or kind of prickly pear group. They're not Opuntias, they're Opuntioids. This is a genus called Arapoa, and it's a low-growing thing, like a low-growing cholla would be. Very spiny, not something that you want to step on, but pretty flowers, kind of very cholla-looking. And then there's another one, Cumulopuntia, and this is a mound former. And this you can find scattered throughout the Andes in many, many locations. Again, very, very spiny stems. And they make these nice symmetrical mounds that would be, probably 4 or 5 feet in diameter. And again, maximum height would be knee height. Some of you may grow gymnocalyciums, and you may grow this particular species. It's a real favorite with collectors. Gymnocalycium spegazzinii. If you have this in a pot on your bench, this is where it originated from. Wonderful spination. Flowers aren't all that much to write home about, but still pretty plant. And there's a Parodia here as well, Parodia nervosa, spiny species, nice orange flowers. And then there's an Ariopsyce that somehow made its way over from Chile, and it ended up in Argentina. Very, very spiny plants. Let's see, large grapefruit sized, I would say, on these plants. The petals don't develop very much, so the flowers kind of stay hidden down within the spines. Okay, so we're going to go to the upper red circle. So we're going to jump up to southwestern Peru. So we're going from Argentina to Peru, and we're going to a specific location. This is going to be a long, memorable area. About 75 miles, actually. We're going to start at fairly low elevation for the Andes, over 8,000 feet elevation. And we're going to go up to about 15,000 feet elevation. We're at the very northern end of the Atacama Desert. So where we start out at the base is very, very dry. The Atacama is the desert that occurs along the Chilean coastal area. It's considered to be one of the driest deserts in the world. The further north you get, the drier it gets. When we get higher, we will get into what's called the Andean Altiplano. Altiplano simply means high plain area. So we're getting up to around 10, 12,000 feet elevation, and we get different topographical features and geological features up there as well. So here is our space station view. You can see two map pins. The bottom one is where we're going to start at about 8,000 feet. And we're going to drive about 75 miles up to the north, up into that canyon. You're probably familiar with Lake Titicaca, which straddles the Bolivia and Peru border. That's Lake Titicaca. It's the highest elevation navigable lake in the world. And it's having all kinds of environmental problems right now. So this is where we're headed. This is called Colca Canyon. At one time, maybe 30 years ago, it was considered to be the deepest canyon on Earth. Since then, they found one or two other canyons in the Andes, which are actually a little bit deeper, but it's still pretty darn deep. And so you can see by the terrain, right at the bottom, you can see the river. That's the Rio Colca, or the Colca River. And then right through here, that's our road. So it kind of hugs along the edge of the cliff. So starting at low elevation, it's very, very dry. Again, the northern end of the Atacama Desert, which is considered to be, by some people, to be the driest desert on Earth. There are cactus here. They're sometimes not the most beautiful species. This is another opuntioid called the genus Cumulopuntia spherica, because the individual stem segments are spherical. So sometimes you can make sense out of taxonomic names. Kind of ugly plants in nature. I don't know, it may look really nice in a pot in time, but at least it's got pretty flowers. Another, probably one that doesn't make blue ribbons on the show benches is this little thing. It's interesting. It's a Cactus. We're going to see a lot of columnar cacti along this trip. And this is a little columnar cactus, Cactus. I'll show you different species of Cactus later, which are much more typical of tall columnar cacti. Cactus aureus, I don't have a picture of a flower to show you, but aureus means it has basically a gold flower. And that's about as big as they get. So the stems are about 6 inches high. And that is one in the prime of its cactus life. It's just perfect. And this is what they oftentimes look like. They grow in clumps. And there's a lot of dead and dying looking things in that clump. The individual stems are short-lived. They only live for a few years. And they maintain their clump by putting out underground stolons and then sending up another shoot. And then that shoot will make a little clump of stems around it. And then that original one will die off. And then eventually that clump will send out another stolon. And so you get families like this. Those were undoubtedly all started from the same individual years ago. And then you find clumps like this, and almost kind of a fairy ring, sort of an assortment. And that whole cluster knows, who knows how many hundreds of years old. We're in an area that doesn't get any rainfall, for crying out loud. They can't grow too fast. But it's probably all the same family clump. There are some things that look a little nicer here. There's an Oreocereus, a low-growing Oreocereus species, Hempelianus, nice red flowers, make nice clusters, nice clumps. That's probably, those individual stems are probably about 4 inches in diameter. A different species of columnar cactus. If you look at the background, we're still down in that dry area. We're still at the kind of 8,000, 9,000 foot elevation where they don't get much rain. This is Weber Bauer-Ocereus, Weber Baueri. Okay, now you look at the vegetation and you see some greenery, some real greenery. So we've gone up. The higher up you go, the more likely that the mountains are going to catch a few passing clouds, get a little bit of moisture sucked out of them, and so there's more vegetation. So this is the other species of Coreocactus. So that little thing that reproduced by stolons was a Coreocactus. This is kind of the big brother of the Coreocactus group. And they make these kind of halfway between a golf ball and a tennis ball. And boy, are they spiny. That's the fruit. That's the fruit. Cumulopuntia boliviana. Again, we showed you this earlier. This is a different subspecies of it, but you get the same idea of the mound-forming characteristics. And again, more vegetation, more shrubby vegetation. So that means that there's going to be a little bit more moisture. So now we're even higher. This is a very special area that exists in several locations throughout Peru, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia. So we're at 12,000 feet here. So look off in the distance and what do you see? You see snow-capped mountains that are towering above our current location. The snow melts in the summertime. The snow melt comes down through the valleys and gets into these flat areas of altiplano, high plain. And the water just kind of accumulates in these areas. And so you get kind of these swampy, marshy areas. And that's where the herders herd their alpacas and their llamas. It's a good foraging area. Succulents, no, not there. On the hillsides behind, yes. But a little alpaca, cute little alpaca. You get up high in the mountains and you start encountering the Andes and you start encountering this thing. And when I was a little kid, I saw pictures of this and I saw how incredibly marvelous to be able to go to places and see things like that. And I still feel that way, even though I've been there. And I don't know why or how I managed to do it, but I've been there and I've seen this. This is actually a member of the carrot family. It's called Ureta, and it's incredibly resinous. That thing is about the size of a large footstool. So maybe 3 feet in diameter, 2 to 3 feet high. and they have incredibly little tiny yellow flowers. And I mentioned that they're resinous, so unfortunately, they are harvested as fuel. How much wood do you see? How many trees do you see? The natives that live up here don't have many options for firewood. Yes, ma'am. Keep in mind that we're getting closer to the equator. So it's cool, but during the daytime, it's tolerable cool. By tolerable cool, 70s, 60s to 70s temperature. At nighttime, yes, it certainly drops down below freezing. The other thing is that there's much less atmosphere at that height, and so the sun intensity is very, 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 very great. And so you can feel the sun, even though the air temperature isn't that hot. There's not much atmosphere to screen out the solar radiation. So yeah, there's succulents. The lobevias, I mentioned the lobevias earlier. There's two species that occur along here. They were not in bloom when I've been there. I've only been to this location once, and they were not in bloom, and I wasn't gonna spend a lot of time counting spines. So I'm not sure what they are, but Lobevia pompana and Lobevia pentlandii. And there's one and there's the other. And you say, boy, they look awfully the same, and they do until you see them growing side by side. So the larger clump at the bottom, and then just above it is the smaller clump. And they are separate species, but I can't vouch for which species they are. So we're up. So these go up to, the highest I've been is 16,000 feet, and they grow at 16,000 feet. Okay, so we're getting to our destination. This is the little town of Chive at the upper end of the Colca Canyon. So the Colca River comes from the mountains and flows down here, and this is an agricultural community high in the mountains, and you see the terraces. These are typical Inca terraces that have probably been farmed continuously for 1,000 years or more, built into the hillside. So lots and lots of potatoes. Of course, potatoes come from Peru and the Andes. And you go into the local markets in places like this, and you can find 100 different kinds of potatoes without any problem whatsoever. Different colors, different shapes, different sizes. So this is going downstream where the canyon is getting deeper and steeper. And so Colca Canyon, and the reason people go there are not for the cactus, believe it or not. They're for these birds. And these are the Andean condors. And so this is kind of my best view of the side of the canyon wall. And the condor, the condor is the biggest flighted bird in the world. They have a wingspan of 10 feet. So they're huge. They weigh 35 pounds. And they're huge. And a bird that big is going to have a little bit of difficulty getting off the ground. So they nest and they roost in little protected niches on the side of the canyon wall. And when they're done hunting for the day, they're mostly scavengers, but when they're done foraging for the day, they come back to these little cliffs, these little ledges, and they settle down for the night. And the next morning, the sun comes up. And what happens when the sun starts to warm air anytime? You know what happens here in the desert when the sun raises a column of air. So the air goes up. And that's what happens. This canyon, this narrow canyon, is like a giant chimney. As the sun is warming the air, you start to get thermals coming up out of the canyon. And when the thermals get to a certain power, the condors say, okay, I can ride these thermals. And they take off from their ledges, and they gradually spin in a spiral and get higher and higher and higher till they get above the canyon wall, and then they go off foraging for the day, looking for the dead animals that they're going to scavenge from. And so if you stand at the edge of the canyon wall in certain places, these things literally come up right next to you. And if you want to experience nature in its purest form, I'm not a good photographer, but anyway, memorable. But cacti, there's cacti there. We saw this species down in Argentina, Arampoa. It's here in Peru as well. Interestingly enough, the locals put these kind of rock and mud walls around their homes. They're not very high. They're kind of like waist high, but they plant cactus on the top, including this little opuntioid thing. And it's not to keep people out, and it's not to keep animals out. At least that's what our guide told us, is to keep evil spirits out. So, and that's not the only species that they use. This is Ostrocylindropuntia subulata. I suspect you grow that here in the desert. Maybe it gets too hot here, I'm not sure, but it's a very common landscape species in San Diego area. But it's a much larger shrub, but you can see it there on the walls as well. And here you see it in nature. It almost grows like a small tree. Ostrocylindropuntia. Cylindropuntia, of course, is the genus of your local choias. Ostro simply means south. So it's basically a Southern American choya, Ostrocylindropuntia. And a close-up. This is the one that, when it's actively growing, has fairly fleshy green succulent leaves at the tips of the stems. We've seen this one before, Coriocactus brevistilis. Up there at high elevation, you could quite nice forests of it. Really quite attractive plants, larger plants. And then moving away from the cacti, those of you who are bromeliad people, this is the local puya, genus of bromeliad. I don't know what species it is. Give you some pictures closer pictures of what it looks like in bud, but unfortunately not in flower. And I haven't been able to track down the species. We got time for another one? Yeah, keep on. Okay. We're going to stay in Peru. And I'm glad you decided to stick around for this one. We're going to a national park. And again, we're going to be high. We're going to be up a little under 14,000 feet elevation. And it's in a beautiful area, beautiful mountainous area, surrounded by including towering snow-capped mountains with glaciers on them and whatnot. And again, you can see where the location is. It's kind of right in the middle of the Andes. And a little bit lower picture, still quite impressive topography. Once you get down below, again, we're above the tree line. So what you see is mostly grasses and forbs and shrubs, but a very nice barrel cactus in the genus Oroya, Oroya borchersii. And again, in the background, you can see the snow-capped Andes Mountains at higher elevation. So, we're up quite high here. These plants are between soccer ball and basketball size. So nice little barrel cactus, very pretty. Nice yellow flowers, yellow spines. Another opuntioid, and again, this is another one of those that if you look through some of the really, really old literature on South American cacti, you might see pictures of this. This is another Ostrocylindropuntia. It doesn't grow up on like a small tree, but it grows as a mat former flat on the ground. and it's floccosa, which of course means it's fluffy or hairy. And it makes these hairy white mounds just covered with hair-like spines, Ostracolindia puntia floccosa. But this is why we're there. These plants are the largest of all bromeliads. This is Huia raymondii. And these plants live for somewhere between 50 and 80 years. They then bloom, so they're kind of like an agave. They bloom once, and then the plants die. And if you happen to be there the right time, the right year, you get quite a display, and we were lucky enough to be there the right year. Huia raymondii, high elevation. So how big are these plants? A little hard to say. Picture of the inflorescence and a close-up, and you can see all the little tiny white flowers tucked in there. Who knows how many hundreds of thousands of flowers develop from one plant. So if you look down in the lower left corner, you see a good friend of mine, Dick Schreiber, who's 6'3". So he's my measuring stick. So the plants typically get to be about 15 feet. The inflorescence gets to be about an additional 25 feet. So these plants tower to about 40 feet in height. All right. Are you willing to go more? No. Shall we stop here? Okay, that's a good place to stop.